Welcome. Welcome, everyone, back to the Wheaton College Philosophy Department Lecture Series. I'm Adam Wood. I'm the chair of Wheaton's Philosophy Department, and it is my privilege tonight to welcome the poet Christian Wiman. You might wonder, though, philosophy lecture series, a poet, what's the deal here? Doesn't Plato say there's an ancient quarrel between poets and philosophers? Well, yes, he does. But immediately after saying it, he adds, and I quote, "If poetry has any argument, any logos to bring forward that proves it ought to have a place in a well-governed society, we'll be glad to admit it, for we're well aware of the charm it exercises." And that is how we Wheaton philosophers feel about poetry, and Christians in particular. If ever any poet living today possesses the sort of logos that Plato wants, it's him. We find it in the many published volumes of his poetry, Every Riven Thing, Survival is a Style, Hammer is the Prayer, and various others. We find it in his essays and nonfiction, including My Bright Abyss, Meditations of a Modern Believer, He Held Radical Light, The Art of Faith, and the Faith of Art, and most recently, Zero at the Bone, 50 Entries Against Despair. As those titles might indicate, Christian is himself a believer with lots to say about faith, its intersection with art, and their role in fending off despair. He's currently Clement-Muehl Professor of Communication Arts at Yale Divinity School. One thing that especially strikes me about Christian's work and career is his generosity in shedding the spotlight on other poets and thinkers, whether Christians or not. Most notably, he did this in his 10 years as editor of Poetry magazine, the premier magazine for poetry in the English-speaking world, and we are truly grateful that he has generously agreed to be with us tonight. After Christian's talk is over, I'm hoping that we can have a period of time for question and answer. There are a couple of microphones in the aisle, and if you'd like to just line up behind them and take your turn to ask questions of Christian, I'll let him field his own questions there. Please join me in welcoming tonight our speaker, Christian Wiman.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's great to be back at Wheaton College. I was here about 13 years ago or so, and once before that actually, but when I was last here, I was here with Roger Lundeen and Brett Foster, who were friends of mine, who are now no longer with us, but their work has been very important to me. And it's a bit sad being back here without them. Strong presences. I'm going to give you a lecture in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about prayer, and then I'm going to talk about callings, and then I'm going to talk about joy. I have an essay in this new book which is about teaching my daughters to pray, and in it I wonder if that's, what that means to pray, and is it something that you actually ought to teach a child to do? And if it is something that we can learn, what exactly should we pray for? There's the funny old joke, you pray for a parking space. Do we pray to be cured from some disease that we have, or that our loved ones might be healed? Do we pray for our children? In thinking about this, I was very drawn to the Polish poet Anna Kamińska. She died in 1986 at the age of 66. She converted to Christianity decades earlier, in her late 30s, I believe, and after the unexpected death of her husband, who was also a poet. It's been my experience that people who've been away from God tend to come back in one of two ways: extreme lack or extreme love, an overmastering sorrow or a strangely disabling joy. Either the world is not enough for the hole that has opened in you, or it's too much. The two impulses are intimately related, and it may be that the most authentic spiritual existence inheres in being able to perceive one state when you're squarely in the midst of the other one. The mortal sorrow that shadows even the most intense joy, the immortal joy that can give even the darkest sorrow a fugitive gleam. Anna Kamińska, she was a devoted and tormented Catholic. Her faith brought her great comfort and great anguish, often at the same time. Not long before her death, she wrote what I think is her best poem, the best available in English at any rate. It's a stark, haunting, and insidiously hopeful little poem called A Prayer That Will Be Answered. The title's worth stressing. A prayer that will be answered. Think of what you pray for. Think of what gets answered. Then think of this. Lord, let me suffer much and then die. Let me walk through silence and leave nothing behind, not even fear. Make the world continue. Let the ocean kiss the sand just as before. Let the grass stay green so that the frogs can hide in it, so that someone can bury his face in it and sob out his love. Make the day rise brightly as if there were no more pain. And let my poems stand clear as a window pane bumped by a bumblebee's head. This is an uncanny poem. It gives God all power, the continuance of the world, and no power. It was going to continue anyway. It's implicitly apophatic, you might say. It sort of asserts what it erases, or it calls into being the very thing that it gets rid of. It's a prayer to be reconciled to a world in which prayer does not work. O Lord, let me not love thee if I love thee not, wrote George Herbert at the end of one of his own greatest poems. We pray God to be free of God, wrote the 13th century mystic Meister Eckhart. Behind Kamińska's poem, infusing it with an ancient and awful power, is the most wonderful and terrible prayer that one can pray. Not my will, Lord, but yours. That's, of course, Jesus before the Roman soldiers have come to take him to his death, just after he has sweated blood, begged God to let the cup of suffering pass him by, and wept to leave this world that he so hopelessly loves. Not my will, Lord, but yours. It's difficult enough to pray a prayer like this when you're thinking of making some big life decision. It's damn near impossible when your actual life is on the line, when all you want to pray is help, help, help. Not my will, Lord, but yours. The poem's uncanny in another way, and triumphant. If you want me again, writes Walt Whitman near the end of Song of Myself, look for me under your boot soles. This poem has a similar ghosting effect. It gives its author a kind of posthumous presence. Let my poem stand clear as a window pane bumped by a bumblebee's head. This, it turns out, has happened. This poem is as clear a poem as you will ever read. And we, the readers, all these decades after Kamienska's death, are bumping our heads upon it. The prayer has been answered. And to feel the full effect of this poem is to feel a little ripple of spirit going right through the stark, indifferent reality to which the poet sought to be reconciled. For a long time, I tried to write a poem that had as its first line, "Are you only my childhood?" By childhood, I meant not only the bubble of Baptist religiosity in which I was raised in West Texas, but also that universally animate energy, that primal permeability of mind and matter that children both intuit and inhabit. By you, I meant you with a capital letter, God. I took dozens of different tacks for the poem, but it was all will, and thus all wasted. Years passed, and then in a half-dreaming state in the middle of the night, I heard myself ask the question again, "Are you only my childhood?" And from deep within the dream, a voice, it was me actually, but the voice didn't seem to be mine, said with what seemed to be genuine interest and puzzlement, "Why do you say only?" Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love, yet strike, cast down, yet help afford, sure I will do the like. I will complain, yet praise. I will bewail, approve, and all my sour, sweet days I will lament and love. It's likely that George Herbert wrote this poem between the ages of 37 and 40. He just swerved from a disappointing political career into parish ministry. He was newly and happily married, and he was obviously dying of tuberculosis. All my sour, sweet days I will lament and love. Destitution and abundance, submission to God and aggression against God. What might it mean to pray an honest prayer? Maybe it means, like Meister Eckhart, praying to be free of the need for prayer. Maybe it means praying to be fit for, worthy of, capable of living up to the only reality that we know, which is this physical world around us, the severest of whose terms is death. Maybe it means resisting this constriction with a little ripple of spirit that cries otherwise, as all art, even the most apparently despairing, does cry. And maybe, just maybe, even means praying for a parking spot, in the faith that there is no permutation of reality too minute or trivial for God to be altogether absent from it. If Jesus' first miracle can be a kind of pointless party trick, he turns water into wine, voila. Maybe the lesson we are all meant to learn from this is that we have to turn everything over to God, including those niggling feelings and hesitations we have that the whole rigmarole of sifting scripture like birds' entrails and bowing one's suddenly brainless head and believing in something more than matter. This is all just a little ridiculous, isn't it? The province, perhaps, of little children. I have two now 14-year-old girls, and when they were 2 years old, we spent a summer in Seattle. I had lived there years before. It was the first break that I had taken for my editing job. I used to edit Poetry magazine in downtown Chicago. I was there for 10 years. I hadn't been able to take a break for 9 years, and it was only 8 months after I had undergone a bone marrow transplant in Northwestern Hospital, also in downtown Chicago. It would have been 2012. Time had a texture that summer, an hourly reality that we could taste and see. The girls went to this little daycare in the mornings, and well, my wife and I could write, and then we all came together in the afternoons and did something in the city. At night, we had our same nightly ritual that we had at home. I would read to the girls and tuck them in bed, and then my wife would take over. And the last thing I said every night was, "I love you," and they always replied promptly, "I love you too, Daddy." But one night, after I had said that, one of my girls, Fiona, was silent. She just kept looking at the ceiling. "Do you love me too?" I asked, foolishly. A long moment passed. "No, Daddy, I don't." "Oh, Fiona, sweetie, I bet you do." Nothing. I didn't know what to do, so, you know, 2 years old, and I just finally said, "Okay, I love you, Finn. I'll see you in the morning." And then as I started to get up, she suddenly reached up and put her little hand on me like this tiny little Lauren Bacall or whatever the equivalent movie actress is today, and she said, "I will love you in the summertime, Daddy. I will love you in the summertime." I've told this to a couple of people who thought it was heartbreaking. My mother thought it was heartbreaking, but I was actually so proud I thought my heart would burst. "I will love you in the summertime." What a piercing, poetic thing to say. At 2 years old, and for weeks I kept thinking about it. I even eventually, about a year later, wrote a poem about it. "I will love you in the summertime," which is to say, given the charmed life that we were living there in Seattle and all the grace and grief that my wife and I felt ourselves moving through at every second, I will love you in the time when there is time for everything, which is now and always. I will love you in the time when time is no more. Now, do I think that that's what my Athena-eyed and mysteriously interior 2-year-old daughter meant by that expression? I do not. But do I think that sometimes life and language break each other open to change? That a rupture in one can be a rapture in the other? That sometimes there are, as it were, words underneath the words, even the very word underneath the words? I do. When Jesus says that you must become as little children in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, he's not suggesting that you have to shuck all knowledge and revert to an innocence or a state of helpless dependence that you've lost or outgrown. The operative word there is become. The Greek words strepho, which more accurately translates as convert, a word that more explicitly suggests an element of will and maturation. Spiritual innocence is not beyond knowledge, but inclusive of it, just as it is of joy and love. For the hardiest souls, even outright atheism may be an essential element. Simone Weil once said there are 2 atheisms, of which one is the purification of God. There is some way of ensuring that one's primary intuitions survive one's secondary self. Or to phrase it differently, ensuring that one's soul survives one's self. Or to phrase it differently, to ensure that one's self and one's soul are not terminally separate entities. To ripen into childhood, as Bruno Schultz puts it. So perhaps one doesn't teach children about God so much as help them grow into what they already know. And perhaps know is precisely the wrong verb. Trying to solve the problem of God is like trying to see your own eyeballs, wrote Thomas Merton. It has been my experience that most adults will either smile wryly at this and immediately agree, or roll their eyes and lament the existence of this benighted superstition that pretzels intelligence into these pointless knots, this zombie zeal that will not die. It has also been my experience that there are on this earth two little children who, if told as Cohen by a father inclined to linguistic experiments, will separately walk over to the mirror and declare that, in fact, Daddy, they can see their own eyeballs. I want only with my whole self to reach the heart of obvious truths. That's Anna Kamienska, near the end of the fractured, intense, diamond-like diaries that circle around and around the same obsessive concern, God. I know just what she means. The trouble, though, as her own life and mind illustrate, is that just as there are simple and elegant equations that emerge only at the end of what seems like a maze of complicated mathematics, so there are truths that depend upon the very contortions they untangle. Every person has to earn the clarity of common sense, and every path to that clearing is difficult, circuitous, and utterly, painfully individual. Here's an obvious truth. I am somewhat ambivalent about religion, and not simply the institutional manifestations, which even a saint could hate, but sometimes, too many times, all of it, the very meat of it, the whole shebang. Here's another. I believe that the question of faith, which is ultimately separable from the question of religion, is the single most important question that any person asks in and of her life, and that every life is an answer to this question, whether she has addressed it consciously or not. As for myself, I have not found faith to be a comfort, but a provocation to a life I never seem to live up to, an eruption of joy that evaporates the instant I recognize it, an agony of absence that assaults me like a psychic wound. As for my children, I would like them to be free of whatever particular kink there is in me that turns every spiritual impulse into anguish. Failing that, I would like them to be free to make of their anguish a means of peace for themselves or others, or both, with art or action, or both. Failing that, and I suppose ultimately, here in the ceaseless machinery of implacable matter, there is only failure. I would like them to be able to pray, keeping in mind the fact, as St. Anthony of the Desert said, a true prayer is one that you do not understand. Here's that poem I wrote. Typically cryptic, God said 3 weasels slipping electric over the rocks, one current conducting them up the tree by the river in the woods of the country into which I walked away and away and away. And a moon-blued, cloud-strewn night sky like an X-ray with here a mass and there a mass and everywhere a mass. And to the tune of a 2-year-old storm of atoms elliptically, electrically alive, I will love you in the summertime, Daddy. I will love you in the summertime. Once in the West, I lay down dying to see something other than the dying stars, so singularly clear, so unassailably there. They made me reach for something other. I said, I will not bow down again to the numinous ruins. I said, I will not violate my silence with prayer. I said, Lord, Lord, in the speechless way of things that bear years and hard weather and witness. This poem is about God speaking reality into being. God said 3 weasels is how it starts. That's consistent with both Genesis and the first chapter of the Gospel of John. The poem is also about the feeling we often have, or at least I certainly often have it, that there's nothing but material reality. And faith involves learning to fit your consciousness to that fact. I said, Lord, Lord, in the speechless way of things that bear years and hard weather and witness. The 20th century writer Simone Weil says that absence is the form God takes in this world, which, like every profound human conception of God, is at once true and untrue. It's true insofar as God does not appear to us in any form beyond the forms of the world. It's false insofar as it assumes that God is not present in the forms of the world in ways that require a lifetime of looking and praying to recognize. Weil's genius is to give form to the feeling of lack that leads a person to cry out that this world, however much it is loved, is not enough. Her language energizes absence, charges it, as in fact it is charged, with divine meaning and power, though the phrase also keeps those things implicit and distant. That's her weakness. She assumes we know what form or forms God takes, and therefore our perceptions of his absence are not simply accurate, but in this life, final. God's absence is an anguish that every honest believer feels. But the problem with Weil's statement is that it stops at this anguish, not realizing that God's absence is always a call to his presence. Abundance and destitution are two facets of the one face of God. And as I just said, to be spiritually alive in the fullest sense is to recall one when we are standing squarely in the midst of the other. But what does that mean, really? What might it look like in an actual life? And this is what I want to talk a little bit about: callings. To do that, I'm going to talk about Osip Mandelstam. He was one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, a Russian modernist, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. He died in 1938 when he was 47 years old. He was last seen at a transit camp for political prisoners in Siberia. He was on his way to a work camp. He was picking through a garbage heap for food. That's the last anyone ever saw of him. One of the greatest poets of the 20th century. It was something that he had foreseen and even actually sort of brought on himself. In 1934, with either incredible bravery or suicidal foolishness, Mandelstam recited at a literary gathering a poem that's now very famous, in which he mocked Stalin. It's called the Stalin Epigram, and he made fun of Stalin's mustache, said it looked like a cockroach, made fun of him, said he was a pig farmer. It was a real attack on Stalin. And, you know, maybe he thought he was among friends, but even friends were beginning to watch their backs by that point. Maybe he believed in his own gifts so much that he mistook that kind of freedom for actual freedom. Maybe he had the saintly sense not to credit safe distinctions between kinds of freedom. And like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, before he left New York to return to his beloved and benighted Germany, did only what his own soul bid him do. In any event, someone at that literary gathering in Moscow, someone whose memory was trained in the same way that Mandelstam's was and could recite a poem after hearing it, which was not uncommon at the time. Somebody took that poem and went back and whispered it into Stalin's ear or to the ear of one of his goons, and that was it. He and his wife, Nadezhda, went from Moscow to Leningrad, out to a place called Voronezh, trying to get food, trying to get work, running from Stalin, always expecting an axe to fall. Come, love, let us sit together in the cramped kitchen breathing kerosene. There's fuel enough to forget the weather. The knife is ours and the bread is clean. Come, love, let us play the game of what to take and when to run, of come with me and come what may, and holding hands to hold off the sun. I did these translations, by the way. Probably that epigram to Stalin only accelerated the events that were going to happen anyway. Mandelstam was a thorn in Stalin's brain. At one point, Stalin called up Boris Pasternak and was asking what he should do about Mandelstam, and Stalin said, is he a genius? That was his last question. And Pasternak famously said, it's the wrong question. But I really think it actually was the right question. It was something about the pure lyric spirit of Mandelstam that Stalin couldn't stand. It really was some freedom that he couldn't allow. People who think that poetry has no power have a very limited conception, I think, of what power means. I think even now, in this corporate country where poets don't get called up on the phone by the president, some little lyric is eating into the fat heart of money. And even now, some portion of Mandelstam's spirit lives behind, as he predicted. You have stolen my ocean, my swiftness, my soar, delivered me to the clutch of up-rupturing earth. And for what? The mouth still moves, though the man cannot. There's no need to heroize the stand against Stalin, and in fact, Mandelstam tried to recant. He wrote pleading letters to Stalin, trying to save himself. It doesn't matter. What matters is the man walking the streets of Voronezh in those last days. He was aware that he was going to be killed. He spent his days not writing poems, because he never wrote them down. He was making them in his head, and he would go home and his wife would memorize them, or friends would memorize them, and that's how they got passed down to us. On the last day that we have any poems from Osip Mandelstam, we have this. This very well could be the last poem that he wrote. And I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear. Myself I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. It was all leaf life and star shower, unerring, self-shattering power, and it was all aimed at me. What is this dire delight, flowering, fleeing, always earth? What is being? What is truth? Blossoms rupture and rapture the air, all hover and hammer, time intensified and time intolerable, sweetness, raveling rot. It is now. It is not. I believe every life is a very particular lens for some vision of life and God. Every single one. Who are you called to be? What form of God will your life clarify? In my own case, when I was about 20 years old, as I was telling a group of students today, I became convinced that the answer to that question in my case was bound up with poetry. Here's one of the first real poems I wrote, sometime in my 20s. A revenant is a spirit that comes back, sort of a haunter. She loved the fevered air, the green delirium in the leaves as a late wind whipped and quickened, a storm cloud glut with color like a plum. Nothing could keep her from the fields then, from waiting braced alone in the breaking heat while lightning flared and disappeared around her, thunder rattling the windows. I remember the stories I heard all my relatives repeat of how spirits spoke through her clearest words, her sudden, eloquent confusion, trapped eyes, the storm she loved because they were not hers, her white face under the unburdening skies upturned to feel the burn that never came, that furious insight and the end of pain. This is a poem about someone seeking one rapturous experience that will clarify everything else. One visitation. In this instance, it's a lightning strike. To be a poet is to be in search of one perfect expression. One poem where everything's resolved. The hunger in your soul is satisfied. Your ultimate prayer is answered. Your calling is completely fulfilled. That's what that's about. Of course, it's also about the inherent futility of that. There's never going to be such a poem. This destroys some poets, the knowledge that they'll never get that sense of resolution. It was destroying me at one point. Eventually, I came to realize that the poem had to be a means and not an end, that the aim was everything. I also came to realize that there are different kinds of callings. There are callings we're born for, and there are callings that we earn. Poetry remains my primary calling. I think it is. You don't really ever get an answer. That's the trouble. But there are all other callings in my life. Editing, and I've spent a long time now, both editing and teaching. And when I started both, I really didn't like them at all. And they're callings that I had to earn. I did eventually come to love both of them very much. But it was a difficult process. This next poem I wrote about 25 years after that poem, Revenant, which is about both of these callings, poetry and teaching, and also another one, faith, which is both given and earned. The poem is called Meaning is Not Man's Gift to Reality, and that's a quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Jewish theologian. There's a word in here, Sonnenblumenbrot, which is just a kind of bread. And the quotations, I'll make this mark when there's a quotation, they're by Paul Celan, the German poet Paul Celan, mid-20th century. Another morning of mist. How many do I have left? Another morning of mist. The habit of lack is hell to break. The German girl had a little black abyss between her two front teeth that flashed, if you can imagine blackness flashing through everything she said. She said, pinning back her turbulent hair and cheerfully chewing English like a Sonnenblumenbrot, that she was tensed about the poetry in my class, since it comes, the little abyss, from the, how do you say, breath crystal of a language? There had been for both of us a boy, American, obviously, and Midwestern, I would guess, who raised his hand like a clean stalk of wheat and asked in a way that was already an answer, shouldn't an experience of God bring us, I don't know, peace? It rained while I was writing this. It rained, and my father died, and it stopped, and it rained, and I leaned down close to a flower for which I had no name, and it stopped. And my great granddaughter tried to think what it might mean to pray, and it rained and it burned, and I found myself in front of faces talking less about connections than the seams between things, because it seems no matter the knowledge or vision, there is this need, this void, this mist. The poem is lonely, the poet says. It intends another, and it goes out toward her. You come downstairs wearing what you wear and moving as you move up to the glass beside me, where we see mostly what we do not see. Neighbors and playthings, tree limbs one tick past implicit. Even the sun's in trust. The poem is lonely. That feeling and revenant of waiting for some holy personal revelation has been turned outward. The poems taught me this, I should say. You don't have an idea and then write the poem. You write the poem and then that teaches you something in your life. And also in that poem, the feeling is shared. And that's my wife there at the end. It's a release from the solitary obsession of revenant, and God is the means of that release. That realization at the end, even the sun's in trust. One last poem in this vein, very short. This actually goes straight down the page in one skinny little line. For all the pain passed down the genes, or latent in the very grain of being. For the lordless mornings, the smear of spirit words intuit and inter. For all the nightfall neverness inking into me even now. My prayer is that a mind blurred by anxiety or despair might find here a trace of peace. It took me much of my life to be able to write that poem with just those few little words. Much of my life to have that realization. And to be more open to joy, which is what I'll end with. It was actually when I was translating Mandelstam that I first began thinking about joy in these lines. What rot has reached the very root of us that we should have no language for our praise? What is, was, what was, will be again. And our whole lives' sweetness lies in these meetings that we recognize. It's very true if you think about it. Think about how much language we have for our pains or for our sufferings or our despairs or our anxieties, and how impoverished the language is for our joys. The precision of pain and the blurriness of joy is how the Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai puts it. The precision of pain and the blurriness of joy. We know how to describe our pains. We often don't know how to describe our joys. I came across an essay around this time. I was thinking about these things by Zadie Smith, wonderful writer, novelist, essay writer, and it was just called Joy, and it was in the New York Review of Books, and she had written about trying to distinguish between joy and pleasure in her case, and she said, you know, she loves, I remember pineapple popsicles. She loves all kinds of food. Her and her husband play all these games of memorizing people's faces and then telling the stories about the faces when they get home. He's also a writer. All instances of pleasure. If she thinks of joy, she can name maybe 5 or 6 in her life, and she goes through what those are, mostly involving love, the birth of her child. One's a drug experience, but then she thinks, does that really count? And she finally decides, no, that doesn't count. And interesting, as I'll say in a minute, the reasons that she comes to that should have taught her more. In the end, she says, if an angel came down right now and offered her an experience of joy, she would say no, because it was too destabilizing. It made the rest of her life seem too barren. She looked around after a moment of joy and she felt, what is the rest of this life? Why is it like this? And I remember thinking at the time, I know what that is. C.S. Lewis says that an experience of joy makes us conscious of a homesickness for a home we didn't know we had. Richard Wilbur says, joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and ache, leaving them Joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and slake, leaving them dumbstruck also with an ache nothing can satisfy. Joy fulfills us completely at the same time as it leaves us with some ache that nothing can satisfy. C.S. Lewis would say, because we've been given an intimation of God, and we want that home that we've suddenly been given a sense of. You can't plan on joy. It's much like poetry in that regard. All you can do is make yourself ready for it. Richard Wilbur also said, try to remember this. What you project will be what you perceive. What you perceive with any passion, be it love or terror, may take on whims and powers of its own. What you project will be what you perceive. Hag writing. Why is what I ask myself. Maybe it is the African in me, still trying to get home after all these years. But when I wake to the heat of morning, galloping down the highway of my life, something hopeful rises in me, rises and runs me out into the road, and I lob my fierce thigh high over the rump of the day, and honey, I ride. That's a funny poem. Poetry can be funny. It's also a fusion of times, the deep African in me. She's an African-American poet. It fuses the deep time and the immediate present. Joy takes away the element of time or fuses times, or releases us entirely from time. Here's another very short one. Small moth. She's slicing ripe white peaches into the Tony the Tiger bowl and dropping slivers for the dog, poised, vibrating by her foot to stop their fall when she spots it, camouflaged, a glimmer and then full on, happiness, plashing blunt, soft wings inside her as if it wants to escape again. I love that poem. It says it's happiness, but the poem is really about joy, I think, or rather a moment of joy that illuminates happiness. The Greeks had two ways of conceiving time, chronos and kairos. Chronos was longitudinal like this, and kairos cuts in like this, chronological and chirological. A moment of joy is something that cuts in this way, and it can illuminate this way. And I think that's what this poem is about. She has this moment when she sees this small moth. You know, she's taking care of her kids, doing what she does every morning. And believe me, this is not always the most fun thing when you're taking care, getting everything ready for your kids in the morning, and you're doing all these things, and it's often chaotic. And suddenly she sees this moth, and this moth makes her think, happiness. Wait a minute, I'm happy. This is what happiness is. This right here. We often go through our lives, Kierkegaard said we go through our lives in unconscious despair. Maybe we go through our lives in unconscious joy too. And here's the moment when it gets snapped into being. That weird word, plashing. This poem is like Anna Kamienska's in that it uses no language that calls attention to itself at all, except for that word, plashing, which suggests water, as if we're suddenly in a completely different element, which joy can make us feel like. Suddenly the entire element of our existence is different. Here's a moment in my own life. I'm going to end with 2 poems. Here's a moment in my own life when I had this experience. This is just simply a man sitting at a window, looking out at a tree, and a flock of birds takes off from the tree. Incurable and unbelieving in any truth but the truth of grieving, I saw a tree inside a tree rise kaleidoscopically as if the leaves had livelier ghosts. I pressed my face as close to the pane as I could get to watch that fitful, fluent spirit that seemed a single being, undefined, or countless beings of one mind, haul its strange cohesion beyond the limits of my vision over the house heavenwards. Of course, I knew those leaves were birds. Of course, that old tree stood exactly as it had and would, but why should it seem fuller now? And though a man's mind might endow even a tree with some excess of life to which a man seems witness, that life is not the life of men. And that is where the joy came in. That life is not the life of men because it's the life of God. This poem started in suffering, began in despair, incurable and unbelieving, dying and without faith, believing in nothing but the truth of grieving, and it exploded into joy. I didn't plan any of it. I started to write a poem about despair, and the poem exploded in a direction I didn't expect. This is another distinction between joy and happiness. You can feel joy in the midst of suffering, not happiness. But in suffering, you can feel joy. One final poem. I won't say anything after the poem, so let me simply say everything beforehand. One night, some of you may know the poet C.K. Williams. He's dead now, but a few years ago, well, it's been 12 or so years ago, but he and I had an argument, and it was about, it was over the email, it was about faith and the possibility of eternity, and we had talked about Philip Larkin's poem, Obad, and that's a poem that's just as sharp a confrontation with death as you will ever come across. Just absolutely stark. I work all day and get half drunk at night, waking at 4 to soundless dark I stare. In time the curtain edges will grow light. Till then I see what's really always there, unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation, yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. That's just the first stanza, and it gets worse from there. So we had an argument, and it had to do with that poem, and I woke up in the middle of the night. This doesn't happen often, and I wrote this poem, which is about a train ride, and all these people are on a train, and suddenly, you know, sometimes on a train you'll see that fantail of sparks. So this is a train ride here in Chicago, and all the people look at this fantail of sparks. The poem is also about Christ, though his name is not mentioned. I quoted earlier today to a class those Hopkins lines, Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. We see Christ in the features of others, in the being of others, in the physical reality of others, the sorrows and joys of others. St. Paul also said, of course, not me, but Christ in me, which suggests the way in which faith enables Christ's life to be our own. St. Augustine said, you are in me deeper than I am in me. Again, that notion of an identity that is truly ours and yet not. Our true identity becomes real when it's remade within the life of Christ. What happens after a moment of joy? This goes back to that Zadie Smith. The reason she didn't think that drugs counted as a moment of joy because of what happened afterwards. She woke up, there's a guy in her room, in her apartment, and, you know, some gross guy, and everything's gross, you know, she's filthy, and she feels terrible, and so she thinks, can this be joy? Can that have been joy if this is what is afterwards? And I think what comes after joy is very important. Jürgen Moltmann says that compassion is the other side of the living joy. Richard Wilbur once said that visions were true of St. Teresa, which quickened her to run God's barefoot errands on the rocks of Spain beneath its beating sun and lock the O of ecstasy within the tempered consonants of discipline. Visions are true which lead to action. Visions are true which find their place in a life of faith. Now this last poem, which, just like the other, began with an image of absolute death. That's what this opening image is here. And then it becomes something else. I have no illusion, some fusion of force and form will save me. Bewilderment of bone light ungrave me, as when the L shooting through a hell of ratty alleys where nothing thrives but soot, and the rat-like lives that have learned to eat it, screechingly peacocked a grace of sparks so far out and above the fast curve that jostled and fastened us into a single shock of, I will not call it love, but at least some brief and no doubt illusionary belief that in one surge of brain we were all seeing one thing, a lone, unearned loveliness struck from an iron pane. Already it was gone. Already it was bone. The gray sky and the encroaching skyline pecked so clean by raptor night, I shuddered at the cold gleam we hurtled toward, like some insentient herd plunging underground at Clark and Division. And yet all that day I had a kind of vision that's never gone completely away, of immense, clear-paned towers and endlessly expendable hours through which I walked teeming human streets, filled with a shine that was most intimately me and not mine. Thank you all. So I'm happy to take questions if people have them. If not, we're done. Okay.
Hi. Is it okay if I go? Okay. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I first heard My Stop is Grand when I was 20 years old, and it's very slowly, like, kind of come up through the concrete to be my favorite poem. And I don't read it that often because, you know, I wanted to like still have that shine to it. So the first thing I want to say is just thank you for the work it must have taken to write this poem, because I'm so grateful, and I know we all are. And
it took 1 hour.
So again?
It took 1 hour.
No.
Yeah.
Well, there's just no hope for any of us then. But I had two questions. My favorite of your poems are always about the subway. And mostly because I guess I take the red line. I live in Edgewater, so I take the red line every time I go to work too. And I was thinking about the third moment in your poem, All Good Conductors, where you talk about some loner, lover, or fool who's lived so hard he jerks awake in the graveyard where he sees coming towards him a beam of light, whose end he is, and what he thinks are chains becoming keys. And I was looking at the chains in between the L today as I was transferring at Lake, and I was curious about the chains becoming keys, because I never got a clear picture, idea of what this means. I guess my first question is this about despair and like suicide? Is this about someone jumping in front of the train, or what's going on with the end of this poem? And then my second question might be a little more simple, but who is Barrows Auditorium?
Okay, these are very particular questions about poems, which I bet people aren't recognizing, but that's amazing you quoted it. Thank you for doing that.
I love it so much.
But no, this is just a guy who's fallen asleep. He wakes up in the train graveyard, and he hears that what he in his dream he's hearing the chain. It's actually the keys on the conductor has all those keys. But you know how sometimes in your reality will infiltrate a dream, and so you hear that sound becomes something in his dream. So it's chains. But in fact, in the poem, so those chains, which are something that could restrain him, are actually keys. That's all. Barrows Auditorium is my lovely aunt, long dead.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you.
So I'm kind of the opposite circumstance. I had no idea who you were until today. But I'm very grateful that I have gotten to hear you talk today. I have maybe a complex or a simple question, I don't know which, but I have a good friend back home who is kind of wondering about Christ from afar, and this person is, you know, suffering from like chronic illness and a lot of pain and stuff like that in life, and is also a poet. And I was just wondering if you had like a word of encouragement for this friend of mine who could use some hope.
Oh, you mean you want me to give you a word, something to tell them that you can tell them?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have to know them or something about them. You know, the best thing you can do is not, you started off mentioning Jesus, but I think the best thing would not be to proselytize, but just to be with them. I mean, I have been very sick in my life and very close to dying, and nothing anybody said made any difference. The only thing that made a difference, and it made a huge difference, was somebody being with me. And yeah, that's been very important. Honestly, you're not going to find the right thing to say. It's just not going to be a right thing to say. The only thing is human presence.
Wow, thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm reading Zero at the Bone, and I've noticed as I'm reading that you're pretty comfortable with interpreting text sort of against the author or irrelevant of the author, as you did with your daughter with I Love You in the Summertime. I'm wondering if you find that happening with your own work as well, either other people or yourself finding things that you maybe didn't intend when you originally wrote the thing. You alluded to poems teaching you things, so if you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, I think I definitely, I think the example you may be thinking of is I am looking at poems by Lucille Clifton, who I looked at tonight, and she says on the video that she does not want this poem interpreted in precisely the way that I go ahead and interpret it. And yes, I think, and I feel completely justified in that, because I think the poem gets away from the writer, and it's the reading that, you know, that particular poem seems to me so obvious that you can't just wish it away. You know, you can say the author didn't intend this, which I do, but I'm sorry, it's in the poem. But by the same token, that doesn't mean anything goes. There are some really boneheaded interpretations. And I've seen my poems, I've had both experiences where somebody has read a poem in a way that I thought was just preposterous and ridiculous, didn't add anything. But quite recently, someone in print read a poem in a way that had never occurred to me, but I saw once she did that it was justified. It made sense. It never occurred to me, that reading, but it's there in the poem. So it can, you know, the poem has an independent life away from your own, and there's not much you can do about it.
So in My Bright Abyss, you write that Christ is contingency, meaning subject to change. And I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit more on that, because I did not understand it when you wrote that.
I think if we take seriously, life is contingency. Our life is utter contingency. There is nothing you know for certain. Scientists can't even know anything for certain. Matter is completely contingent. I take the great gift of God is to come down among us into contingency, into absolute contingency. And it wasn't this absolute thing then coming down and being absolute, being this different element than we all are. I understand God to have entered contingency, which means subject to the same things we're subject to: death, loss, God's absence. What have you, being subject to contingency in the same way that we are. So that's how I understand Christ as contingency. Do you understand that?
No.
Still no?
But I'm okay with that. Yeah.
Huh. Okay, I don't know how to make it clear. Well, I give up.
Hi, my name is Eunice Park, and thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask, how and when did you fall in love with poetry and started writing poems?
Well, there's a story that I told recently on a podcast. When I was 7 years old, we went to First Baptist Church in Dallas, which was the largest Baptist church in the world at the time. Maybe it still is, I don't know. But on the day that, one Sunday, they were accepting people down front for the altar call, and I had written a poem, "I love the Lord and He loves me, I will not forget and neither will He." And I took it and I put it in the hand of W.A. Criswell, was the guy's name then, and then I just ran back. So instead of converting, I gave him a poem. And he put it in the Southern Baptist newsletter. It's actually, it's in there. And so, I mean, you can check this story. He put it in there. So clearly I was making these things when I was a little kid, but we had no books in our house. I certainly didn't know what a poet was or anything, and you know, I must have made that from a hymn, hearing hymns all the time. But really it was college, and I got a semester abroad once to England. I got a fellowship, and I bought a book that had the selections of Yeats and Eliot together. And I remember it very clearly, and sitting out there and reading those two things, and just the sound of it just got in my head. It was just like, I have to do that. I have to make those sounds. And so that was really when it happened.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Grace Eccles, and I have one question. Why do you write?
Well, like I said, I think of it as a calling. It's just something that's in me. I start to go crazy if I don't. That's the main reason. I start to go crazy. Unpleasantly crazy. And there's something in me that needs writing to make the world make sense. And I think it has more to do with the forms of the art than the content of it. It's making these things that are like physical works of art. So that, I hope it's to serve God. I hope that that's my ultimate aim. I am at times convinced that it is, but at other times I wonder. But I'm quite sure that if I don't do it, I really get messed up, which is a problem because you don't have control of poetry. I can always write prose, but it doesn't have quite the same release.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Is that a good place to stop? Yeah. Oh, we got one more? Okay.
I am really fascinated by the idea of destitution and abundance as two faces of that same God. And also your attraction to Simone Weil, who seems to really emphasize suffering without resurrection. And I was just wondering, those two, abundance, destitution, those can be they can be very attractive as sort of edges of the experience. And I was wondering about poetry, if poetry can only be born of either the destitution or abundance experience, rapture, but also somewhere in the middle.
Can it be can it only come out of those two things, intense experience?
I was just wondering about the challenge of being in the middle, because being on those extreme situations in some ways are so dramatic that, of course, poetry come. Of course, the life feels sometimes out of body or ecstatic experience or, profound suffering. But I think one of the biggest challenges of life or poetry is that when you're in the middle place. And I just wanted to hear your opinions on that.
Yeah, I do think one of the biggest challenges of faith is when you're just in that middle place. You have an experience of joy, and then after that, it just flattens out, and you're just going through your days. And that can be a real threat to faith, in some ways more of a threat than an intense feeling of absence can be. There are poets who write out of a middle ground of experience, some poets I love. For whatever reason, I seem to need a real jolt, and I do seem to need these extremities. But I'm very glad that those extremities have come to include joy, because at one point in my life, it was only the extremity of destitution or absence or lack that I could feel. There's a phrase, light writes white. You all know that famous idea that they can't sort of trace back who said it, but it was famous among the modernists. Light writes white, meaning that if everything's great in your life, you don't have any suffering, no anxiety, no tensions, then you sit down to write, you got a blank page. All right, so light can only produce a blank page. You need something to give you some tension, something to get the words going. So the problem with that is that, as I told the class today, the extension of that is John Berryman's saying that the luckiest artist is the one who experiences the greatest suffering short of death, which is ridiculous. And so I eventually came to some middle ground between abundance and destitution. You know, I do think that some poems are written out of, I mean, it's not all. That particular poem was electrifying. Like I said, I woke up in the middle of the night, I wrote it in an hour. And that's a complicated form, you know, it absolutely beyond my, I would say it's beyond my ability to write that poem, and yet I wrote it. So you know, that's a complete mystery to me. But then there are other poems that you work on for a long time, and you're not so charged, you know.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all.